Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder, and today we are going to discuss John F. Kennedy's domestic agenda. He becomes president in 1960, assumes the presidency in 1961, and is unfortunately assassinated in 1963. So the summary is, the civil rights movement starts gaining momentum in the 1950s under President Eisenhower, but there's a number of issues that are kind of boiling under the surface, causing Americans concern. The space race we're losing, and the Cold War is still going on. There's a U-2 spy plane incident that the Cold War might heat up at a moment's notice. So these deep, unsettled problems remain from the 1950s, and going into the 1960s, we need a new generation of political leadership to deal with it. And so the election of 1960 is John F. Kennedy and his vice president Lyndon Johnson versus Richard Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., the grandson of the guy from World War I from the Senate. In both of these men are the first two presidents in an election to both be born in the 1900s. The Navy, they served in the Navy during World War II. They've both been elected to the House and the Senate. They're passionate about foreign affairs and support the goals of the Cold War. They're young, energetic, and intelligent. However, Kennedy comes from a wealthy background in politics. He attends Harvard. He is Catholic, which a president had never been before. And Nixon's family was poor. His father worked from paycheck to paycheck. He had to work during school to make ends meet. But a lot of Americans respected him for his time as vice president under Eisenhower. For the first time, really, television has a major influence on the election, and the people of America see the candidates giving their positions. And due to being in the hospital for a little bit during the campaign, Nixon is pale and exhausted after getting back out there and trying to make up for lost time. Kennedy had been campaigning in California and was tanned and healthy. So when they agree to these debates, people are looking at how they look and not necessarily what they say. The campaign boils down to how the candidates looked and spoke, not whose position was better. And it was people who listened to this on the radio thought that Nixon won the debate, but people who had watched it on television thought that Kennedy won the debate. So for the first time, a president's appearance is playing a role in whether or not we're going to elect him. It's the closest presidential race since 1888. The popular vote is extremely close. The electoral vote isn't that close. But if a couple thousand people here or there in places like Texas and Virginia or West Virginia vote differently, the election could have gone to Nixon. Nixon will become president later in 1968. Kennedy wins, and he surrounds himself with what the press called the best and the brightest to help him run his administration. Robert McNamara is the former president of Ford Motor Company, so he becomes the Secretary of Defense. Dean Rusk becomes the Secretary of State. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Was a former Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, and he makes his little brother, Robert Kennedy, or RFK, the Attorney General who is in charge of the Justice Department. Kennedy's domestic agenda is called the New Frontier. And that's Kennedy's term he uses in a speech to describe the chance for Americans to do new great things and to improve economy, healthcare, education, civil rights, and space really is the new frontier. So the space program as well, we need to beef up to beat the Soviets. In the economy, Kennedy does three things to increase or to help out social programs. He pushes for an increase in the minimum wage. He extends Social Security benefits, and he makes welfare system improvements. He pushes those through Congress. He also gets Congress to pass the Equal Pay Act, which helps out for women, requiring equal pay for equal work in industries that engaged in commerce or produced goods for commerce, because since Congress oversees overstate commerce and they regulate it, they have the right to make this law. Unfortunately, the law has loopholes to get around it, and it's hard to enforce and or measure equal work between a man and a woman. But it is a good first step. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act will outlaw discrimination based on race and gender. And to improve the economy, Kennedy also does something called deficit spending, which is spending more money than you have. Okay, but that money has to come from somewhere, so we borrow the money in order to spend more than is received from taxes. It jumpstarts the economy, but it also creates national debt, and that'll be a problem as we approach the 1980s, was increasing national debt. At first, Kennedy is very passive on civil rights. He doesn't want to risk alienating the Southern members of his own Democratic Party, and he doesn't really have a strong hold or the support of Congress yet, being such a young, new president. He does end up sending federal protection for the Freedom Riders through Alabama and Mississippi. He sees the violence in Birmingham toward the nonviolent protesters there, led by Martin Luther King. He also introduces a civil rights bill in 1963. It will not be passed before he is assassinated, and so Johnson picks up where he left off, and it will become the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. The space race is the term for the competition between the Soviets and the U.S. to land a man on the moon. We have been falling behind the Soviets for a while. They launched Sputnik, they put the first dog into space, and now they put the first man into space. Yuri Gagarin, this man here, is the first man in space. Kennedy, at this point, throws massive support behind NASA and gives us the lofty goal of landing a man on the moon by 1970. And I'm going to do my Kennedy impression. He says, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." That's my Kennedy impression. And finally, just beating the deadline on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong, a graduate of my alma mater, Purdue University, one of the most famous people I've ever had the chance of speaking to, becomes the first man to set foot on the moon. Then finally, Kennedy's reign as president ends on November 22nd, 1963. They're in Dallas on business, but they're treated to a parade. It's very hot that day, so they sit in the back of an open-air limousine, and there's no bulletproof protection. But Kennedy is very, very popular, so who would want to hurt him? As the car approaches this building called the Texas School Book Depository, Kennedy is shot in the head. The limo raced to the hospital, but it is too late. And President Kennedy dies. So who shot Kennedy? Lee Harvey Oswald's palm print is found on the gun that was used in the shooting, and he is charged with murder. Just a little background on him. He's a former Marine, so he does know how to handle a rifle. He is dishonorably discharged from the Marines, and he lives in Russia and is rejected by them as well. So he's kind of a man without a country. And he supported Fidel Castro in Cuba, and he is upset with the Bay of Pigs decision, which we'll get to when we talk about Kennedy's foreign policy. And he never got his day in court. He was never punished for what he did, because as Oswald was being transferred between jails, Jack Ruby, a man named Jack Ruby, broke through the crowd and shoots Oswald point blank in the stomach and kills him. He is a local nightclub owner. He has links to the mob, which leads to some conspiracy theories that the mob had Kennedy and Oswald killed, so we'll never know. Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, Kennedy's vice president, is sworn in as president aboard Air Force One on the way back to Washington. Here you can see him being sworn in with Jacqueline Kennedy, JFK's wife, by his side. Did Oswald act alone? Could one person carry out this plan? The Warren Commission, named after Chief Justice Earl Warren, they conduct the official investigation and describe Oswald as the lone killer. So that is Kennedy's somewhat short and cut short presidency. He was a very, very popular president. People felt as if they had lost a member of their own family when he died. You should ask people in the older generations where they were when they heard Kennedy was shot. They'll probably be able to tell you. And it was a very, very sad day in America. So November 22nd, 1963. And Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes president. Next time we'll talk about him. So fill out your learning targets, and I will see you back here then. Bye-bye.